Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Tuesday the 9th of May, and you are watching episode 85 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, The Rational Voice, What We Need to Know, is my guest Selwyn Button, Chair of the Lowitja Institute. Selwyn is an experienced senior executive who has led large health, education and governance organisations across government, private and not-for-profit sectors. Currently, Selwyn is a partner of both the PricewaterhouseCoopers Australia and the PricewaterhouseCoopers Indigenous Consulting, chairperson of Lowitja Institute and committee member for numerous boards, including Australia's Children Education and Care Quality Authority, the Institute for Urban Indigenous Health, and Queensland Rugby. A Gungari man from southwest Queensland, Selwyn was raised in Chursburg, and for many years he led policy, service delivery, and legislative reforms to support the improved outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Prior to his PricewaterhouseCoopers role, he was the first ever Indigenous person to hold a role of National Register, Office of the Register of Indigenous Corporations, in which he regulated and supported more than 3,000 organisations, of which the top 500 generated around $2 billion annually. Selwyn has also served as Assistant Director General for Indigenous Education in Queensland and the Chief Executive Officer of the Queensland Aboriginal and Islander Health Council. Selwyn is a former primary school teacher and Queensland police officer who holds a Master's of Public Administration and Bachelor of Education. He was the Wildenstein Scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and is an active member of the Harvard Club of Australia. Welcome, Selwyn.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
It's a pleasure to have you here. If we could just start off with a little bit of your background, because obviously you've had a long journey from where you come from to where you are now. And obviously you're in Canberra today. So obviously you're a person who goes from pillar to post across Australia by the sound of it.
Yeah, get around a little bit. So I have to do a bit of travel in my job and certainly in some of the advocacy work that we do as well. But look, a little bit about myself. Bill, I grew up in country Queensland. So I was born in a little place called Wandai, which is about 3 hours northwest of Brisbane. I was then raised in Cherbourg, which was the former Aboriginal mission, just down the road, only about 10 k's away, and lived between Cherbourg and Mergen for most of my, I guess, formative years and schooling life before I graduated from year 12 at Mergen High and went off to the big smoke in Brisbane to go to university.
Well, I suppose that's the thing for most people out in the regions. If you go back, 20 years or so, you had to go to Brisbane to get that tertiary education. Fortunately, it's a little bit better now, like even in Kansas, there's a university, but still for a lot of courses, if you want the elite courses, you still got to go down to Brisbane for Queensland University and other institutions, especially in particular fields. Yeah.
No, look, things have changed a little bit, but yeah, a lot of the time people are moving out of the regional areas to go off to university post senior schooling, and just like I did, and I went and lived on campus for a couple of years while I was studying teaching.
Your teaching career, that's a fairly interesting career these days and challenging career. Can you give us an idea of some of your experiences there, and then what opportunities came along for you to leave that career?
Yeah, look, when I graduated from teaching and started doing some I guess applied teaching back then, I was still pretty young and still pretty immature in the sense. I think I was only 20 years old when I finished university to become an actual teacher. But still pretty immature and not knowing. I was doing primary school. I studied primary teaching. But certainly going into the world of work and experiencing what it was like and getting an understanding of, I guess, what you want to be when you grow up and all those sorts of things. I didn't stay in teaching very long. It was only about 18 months, and then I ventured off to join the police because I had a heap of friends from university and a few other circles that I was sort of socialising in at the time that thought it was a good idea to go then and sign up to go to the police service and go to the academy.
Sounds like jumping out of the frying pan into the fire. The police is another pretty hard job these days.
Yeah, look, it was a little bit like that. And I, like I said, I was pretty immature. Only a young bloke, really didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. So was just trying out a few different professions along the way, and ended up in policing and stayed there for about 6 years.
Well, that's a reasonable time. I mean, I think when people join up in the armed forces, they're usually on about a 6-year first term contract sort of thing. So it is a reasonable part of a person's life, even 6 years in one profession. Yeah.
Look, and I certainly credit the police service in the time that I was there. And my time there was in the late 90s when I was in the police, and sort of early late 90s. And then I credit the police service and that experience to a lot of my own maturity and growing up and seeing things that go on through a police lens, and I guess experiencing a fair bit of I guess the work that police put up with across the state, that certainly helped me grow up and helped me then understand the depth and breadth of issues that go on in communities.
Well, I suppose it's similar for people who join the military. I mean, that sort of makes people mature a little bit quicker than they would normally. So, because I joined at about 15 as an apprentice, and so although you're mothered a reasonable bit, you did learn to fend for yourself and learn to do the ironing and all those sort of things that most people miss out on when they're 15 or 16.
Yeah. No, look, and no different to, I guess, what you would have experienced in your military career. I learned very early on in the piece how to polish my boots, and to this day I don't have any issues in polishing boots. So I'm still very skilled at doing those sorts of things.
From there, you would have had to take more courses to advance to where you are today and the other jobs you passed through. So was it a mixture of studying and then also finding different positions that suited you? Was that the sort of thing that was going on was education and jobs at the same time, working forward?
Yeah, look, it was a little bit of a mixture, and certainly it was about moving back to something that I originally studied. So having already studied teaching, I then stepped out of the police and went back to work in the education department in a few different policy roles, and certainly learnt a lot and studied a few bits and pieces along the way to I guess retrain and re-educate myself in what teaching was like, to then work in a more of a policy environment.
Well, then I have to ask you the question: what were the influences that made you a person who tried hard at academia and looked forward to position? Was it something the family type sort of thing because of mum and dad, or was it just a self-drive, or what?
No, look, it was more self-driven. To be honest with you, I mean, both my parents, and this is no different to a lot of people who grow up in regional areas and in rural communities. My parents didn't go to university. They only barely finished high school themselves. So it wasn't like mum and dad had already had that experience. I've got an older brother. He didn't go to university either. He went off and got a trade. But that was the norm back in Bergen and Cherbourg back then. So one of the things, the biggest industry when I was growing up at the time was the local meatworks. I worked there myself during school holidays and everything else, and that was the expected norm. The expected norm in my home community was that once you finish school, you end up with a job at the meatworks, whether or not you're on the slaughter floor or you're one of the tradies that's providing the maintenance services in the abattoir itself. So that was the norm for us. But going off to university was a little bit different.
So you broke the mold.
Yeah. Yeah. When I had others around me who obviously supported my aunt. She'd become a teacher prior to that, and obviously just having conversations with teachers who I got on with at the local schools, because being in a small town, you get to know everyone anyway, and so having conversations with local teachers, they encouraged me to go and study teaching. So that was the path I chose.
So now, but you're well and truly sort of centred around major cities and that in all the most of the activities you do.
Yep.
So where's your permanent residence?
My permanent residence is in Brisbane. So when I go home, I go to Brisbane.
at least you've got a place to put your head in after all the travel around to Canberra and all the other functions. Because I was speaking to Jo, and she was up here in Cairns this week, scouting out for your convention or conference coming up in June. Yep. So if you could now sort of go on to your roles of today and how you got to be the chair, and obviously you've taken over from Pat, who's well known through the communities. So give us a bit of insight on how you made your way to where you are now.
Yeah, no worries. And certainly for being the chair of the Lowitja Institute has been a big privilege for me, and taking on that responsibility post Pat Anderson, who's certainly held it in stead for a long time. Since its inception, and I'd been on the board, I guess, essentially as a quasi deputy for Pat for many years. So I've probably been on the board for about 8 years before I then I guess started to have conversations with Pat, or she started to have conversations with me to tell me that she was going to step down soon, that she wanted to start slowing down. I don't think she's slowed down at all. She's doing plenty of work around in supporting the voice across the country these days. But for her, it was about slowing down and taking a bit of a backward step from the Lowitja Institute, and it was a conversation that her and I had about me potentially taking on the role. So I was pretty chuffed that she'd asked me to do that, and certainly have been privileged enough to have the support of the rest of the board members. And so now I've been the chair for a couple of years, and certainly for us, it's about how do we progress and take the organisation into a new space. And we're looking forward to having the international conference up in Cairns in June.
Can you tell us a little bit about the role and its goals and expectations?
Yeah, no. So look, the Lowitja Institute, we are a research institute. We don't necessarily do the research ourselves, but what we do is that we actually fund and commission research. So there's a couple of pieces. We commission research across the country. So what we do is we work with organisations. We work essentially with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations to determine what our research priorities are. So we go and have conversations with Indigenous communities across the country, and based on those conversations, we determine a set of research priorities that we think we should be following. We are a community-controlled organisation, and so our members are other community-controlled organisations, both Aboriginal Medical Services and a whole range of others across the country. And so we connect to our members, have conversations with them to determine research priorities, and then we commission the research through those organisations and through universities to make sure we're focusing on the research that we think is necessary for our communities. The other piece that we do is that we actually fund research scholarships. So there's a lot of Indigenous, I guess, PhD students and researchers across the country these days that have all been, I guess, they've all benefited from a Lowitja Institute research scholarship. So a lot of our work is about building, not only funding and commissioning research out in community, but also building the number of Indigenous researchers that exist in university settings across the country as well.
Do you find your focus is sort of Indigenous in sort of more developed areas like Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane and that, and how much goes to sort of regional people? Because I come from the regions, and I reckon we were always studied because we're simply overwhelmed by the representation, the activities in Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne. So how do you bounce opportunities or solving problems of people in various places, because Australia is a big place and you've got five states to look at as well with their own individual problems.
Yeah, no, look, and for us, the priority is about funding research in community that others won't touch or won't fund, and most of that, and predominantly because of the beginnings of the Lowitja Institute started in the Northern Territory. It was actually created by Congress. Congress is the Aboriginal Medical Service in Alice Springs. So Congress and Dilba, that's the one in Darwin. Those two organisations created the Lowitja Institute many years ago. And so the priority for us is making sure that research happens where it's needed. And majority of that is actually out in rural, remote areas. We still fund research projects in urban areas, in urban settings across the country, but predominantly because we're funding research projects that universities don't necessarily prioritise. It's actually funding projects that are happening in rural communities.
Yeah, and they're definitely in need of assistance and advancement.
Yeah.
Maybe we can turn now to the article which was published in, I think it was about mid-April, and it basically came up with 10 points. And if we, I don't know, do you want to go through it as item just to make sure we cover everything, and then have a general discussion after?
Yeah, that's okay. Happy to do that.
I'll just share a screen and with the first item. Right. So this was the first statement. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So this was the first statement on Pat's list, and basically it centres from the Uluru Statement was the basis for the Indigenous voice. But there were a lot of things that came out of the Uluru Statement and those meetings, because you really go back to actions in regards to closing the gap as well. There was a lot of discussion during that period about closing the gap, and you got a number of agreements and targets and that from that Uluru meetings and statements. And the voice was just I think it was more a part of that, not the whole dialogue in regards to what they wanted to achieve in the long run. Yeah,
and certainly prior to that, a lot of the precursor meetings leading up to the Uluru Statement had happened where Aboriginal Islander people had come together to talk about the whole notion of constitutional recognition and what that actually meant. Starting way back to, I guess, conversations happening at 2013 with the Referendum Council. The Referendum Council was formed back then. I think it was when it wasn't John Howard. It was when Julia Gillard was the Prime Minister, and she formed the Referendum Council to come up with I guess a list of things or come up with some options in looking at recognition for Aboriginal Islander people. And so the Referendum Council then gave a report back to the government. Government then obviously changed because we had the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd era, and then it moved to Tony Abbott. But certainly in 2015, where the Uluru dialogues actually came from, was a meeting that was held in 2015 when Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister, Bill Shorten was the opposition leader. I was at that meeting, Pat was there as well, and they were asking us as a group, there was 40 Indigenous people in the group at that meeting, and they were asking us to say, okay, well, what do you think we should be doing about constitutional recognition? And as a group, we collectively had agreed to a set of priorities. One of those priorities was asking the Prime Minister and the opposition leader at the time to fund what we described as constitutional conventions, that we needed to have constitutional conventions happen across the country in regional settings all across Australia that led to a national convention where we could actually have conversations with our own people about what they thought recognition should look like. Those things started in 2015, then went to 2017, and those conventions became the Uluru Dialogues. And so the culmination of that national convention at Uluru in 2017 or 16 was then, which led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is essentially the end result of all of that work that was going on in having those regional dialogues and constitutional conventions.
Who do you think had most or input to that? Do you think the outlying Indigenous communities had enough input, or was it too much driven by people from the city, intellectuals who already had a preconceived idea of what they wanted?
Yeah, no, look, it was absolutely driven by local people. It was driven by people in local communities, and deliberately, when people were going through the process of determining who should come along to those dialogues or those constitutional conventions, it was prioritizing people who do not necessarily have a voice. And so it wasn't about going down the path of appointing or picking the usual suspects who get a voice all the time. It was about saying, okay, well, who doesn't get a voice, and how do we prioritize the vulnerable voices so we can hear them and we can work out what they actually want and what they think constitutional recognition should look like.
Okay, we'll move on to point 2 and 3. It basically says Aboriginal people aren't recognised in the Constitution, and basically that's why you need to have it in the Constitution, the First Nations voice, and it's not just to be symbolic; it has to have meaningful and meaning and make meaningful changes to their lives. So that was point 2.
Yep.
So to have meaningful, I think does that set the agenda for what form it needs to take? If it's to be meaningful, or can be meaningful, have a reasonable amount of scope in it. This is one part, this is another part. And as long as we get somewhere in there, that's fine. Or no, we just got to have this whole. This is the one part we need. Is that? And it's not debatable.
Yeah, and look, that was, and again going back to that meeting we had in 2015, what we proposed with the constitution, with those conventions, and what we actually suggested is that when we're talking about constitutional change, it just can't be something that is superficial. You've got to have its constitutional change has got to be meaningful. So just by the form of recognition itself wouldn't be sufficient enough. It was about saying we need to actually have something in the Constitution that only recognises Indigenous people, but also then gives effect to making sure that we can make some significant change to improve their life circumstances. And so that was the starting point. We didn't actually say back then that needed to be a voice. That came out of the constitutional conventions when we went around, when the group went around talking to people all across the country. That was the consensus. The consensus was, okay, we think the best way to do that is through a voice.
It took a fair time to get to that position, but yeah, in the last 12 months, it's moved forward rapidly. But I found the conversation maybe back in the later half of last year is the people who were formulating the words in that were still stuck. Really what they wanted. And now we also, going forward, the government in regards to what it looks like is sort of resident on saying, well, what powers and that it will have. So we've only just started we've formulated the words, but we just don't know what legislation is going to be behind it.
No, and that's part of the normal process, and certainly the way that any constitutional change works is that the clause, what's voted on at the referendum, is the question, the clause, and so you can see what the clause is, and then what's legislated after a successful referendum, they then come up with the legislation that informs what the clause looks like, which is part of that process of giving power to the Parliament. So Parliament then decides on how you implement it.
I suppose that's why so many referendums fail in Australia, because I think we've we've had about 40 odd, and we've only had about 8 or so that have passed. And the ones that have passed, when you look at them, they're fairly clear. You know, it says we're going to delete this section and rewrite it as this, or we're just going to repeal this, and people can see a clear vision of what's going to happen. There's not a lot of things that are passed where it was left to some ambiguity, because I think that's what makes Australians balk. And unless we have a complete clear understanding what we're buying, I suppose that's going to make it be much harder to get through.
Yeah, look, and I agree. The difficult part is now convincing the Australian public of what this should look like, or what it can look like, so that people can then go to the polls at the end of the year and tick the yes box. But
you're saying what it could look like or should look like. But do we trust the government to deliver what we should or would like it to be? You know,
yeah.
Well, I don't know if people have got that much trust in governments.
No, and there isn't, and it's common knowledge that there's not a great deal of trust in government these days. But what I think we can trust is that there will be a process that is undertaken when the draft legislation is put together. There's processes undertaken to take that legislation out to the community. So there's a full consultation with the Australian public about what the form and function should look like. We can talk about what it and describe what it might do. And certainly that should be the conversation we're having now, is getting out in the public domain and talking about what the benefits of the voice should look like and what it can do and what change it could potentially make. But the devil will be in the detail when the legislation comes to fruition. But that's the piece.
It's like the budget. Somewhere in those thousands of pages, there's bombs waiting for everyone.
Yeah, and that's the part. That's the process, and certainly that's the encouragement that we give to the Australian people, is to say, look, there is going to be an opportunity for everyone in the country to see what this legislation looks like. That'll come after the referendum, and we'll all be able to then voice views and opinions about what the form and function of the voice should look like, and also make sure that it's the Parliament that has the power over what the voice structure and function does.
Okay, then we'll look at point 3. Other countries have Indigenous constitutional recognition, and that's true. But the point is also highlighted. It is difficult to compare Australia to other nations such as Canada and New Zealand and the United States, because those nations all had historical recognition of Indigenous peoples through the First Contact Treaty. Australia is quite a different situation in regards to when you talk about Canada and New Zealand and United States, and also going into even Africa and that, because the situation was that there was the tribes had structures in the people recognised, and also the people of the tribes in that recognised the authority of a chief or a set of chiefs or what, and so that was a pretty clear sort of indication. But I still take a point in regards to early recognition, in fact that usually it was a matter of, there was always an initial push, but when the pushback came from the inhabitants, the Indigenous people, and they had a certain strength, well, then treaties were negotiated. If you look at New Zealand, there was no treaty until 1840, and until the different tribes gathered together and fought back against the inhabitants, the colonisation. So they came from a point of strength and forced the treaty. In the United States, they had treaties as they moved across different Indian territories, but the United States treaties weren't worth the paper they were printed on or written on, because the United States government continually broke treaties with the North American Indians. So that's pretty hard. But in Australia, we have a situation where the sovereign bodies of the Indigenous people in respect to tribes it was fairly difficult to recognise, if you know. I suppose the situation is, in a lot of cases, people viewed that there wasn't a person of the tribes and that who had ultimate power. So it became a bit of an issue in regards to, working out who you're talking and could an agreement be made. So that's the sort of thing you're trying to overcome now, and now you're trying to do it on behalf of several hundred different groups of people. So it makes a big challenge these days in regards to doing it.
Yeah, and look, and you only have to look at the processes that are going on at the moment in Queensland and Victoria are good examples where there's been conversations about treaty that have been going on for the last couple of years. It hasn't landed yet, and the difficulty that both governments are coming up with is determining what it looks like. Is it a single treaty? Is it multiple treaties? Who do you negotiate with? How do you respect the wishes of Indigenous people? What's that all look like in terms of the negotiation process to determine then what treaties need to happen across the country? The biggest difference, in certainly from the context of Canada and New Zealand and the United States, is really about that recognition of the sovereignty. There is no recognition of sovereignty in Australia. It's not recognised under legal construct in our country, but it is recognised in those countries, and so that's why the structure of looking at the voice and getting that in the Constitution is a means of looking at having something that then starts to focus on providing a solution to negotiate and to enable what it might look like to determine, how do you get consistency and how do you approach things like treaties and other pieces as well.
I think that's the point where we need the voice sort of in the first instance, because regardless of what's going on in some of the states, especially like South Australia and Victoria, and talking about having treaty and it's a matter of law, it's a matter of fact. You can't make a treaty with your own population, your own citizens. Treaty exists between two sovereign powers. So what they're doing in regards to the treaties in Victoria and South Australia is I think is really a disservice, and probably takes away from the voice's first instant role, and then working forward from the voice. Do you see the actions of what's going on with treaty somehow sort of making noises over the voice?
Yeah, look, and in some cases there's been confusion, and what it does create within the public is confusion, because what we haven't landed and what we haven't worked out is how do those pieces of the puzzle fit together, and so until you've landed what it looks like, people are going to be confused and not know which way to go and which thing is going to work best for local communities. So I think you're right. It's about working on this piece of the puzzle that we've got now. The opportunity we've got is the referendum for a voice. We've got a voice in place. The voice will then have a nationally consistent approach to looking at, okay, how do we have the conversations about what treaties then look like.
Yeah, I think it's like the horse and cart, chicken and eggs, and I think really the voice is got to be out there in the first instance before we go to those sort of problems, because like I say, it is a fairly significant problem in regards to having a treaty with your own citizens in law, and then like you say, how is one individual little group go to speak for up to 700 different tribal areas and groups? So yeah. it's a little bit difficult for most people to digest it at once.
Yeah, and look, and that's why the sequencing of the steps in the Uluru Statement start with voice. It starts with voice, and then there's treaty, and then there's truth telling. And the sequencing is deliberate because it focuses on making sure you're going to give effect to the next one. Okay,
we'll share the next one. The voice will be advisory only. The courts won't give power to, the voice will have the power to make representation to Parliament and governments so they can make better policies and direct taxpayer programs where they will make the most difference. Yes, and I mean, we've had, and there's just a statement under there that different people who sort of support this proposition that it's an advisory body only, and but there's other people who don't see it that way. They see it as a starting of a wedge to get to the High Court. So where do you think the truth does lie?
Look, if I give you an example of something that currently exists, and it's already written into the Australian Constitution, which is parliamentary committees. Parliamentary committees exist as a clause in the Australian Constitution because the Constitution gives power for the Parliament to form committees. And the reason why parliamentary committees are formed is that they actually analyse policy and legislation on behalf of the government to give advice to the government. Most parliamentary committees actually just contain members of Parliament, senators and MPs. But when government is going down the path of looking at some specific content knowledge, they do adopt members of the public to sit on those committees. And the members of the public then provide that expert advice and then hand that report back to government for them to put into effect. Sometimes they take the advice, sometimes they don't. But they're provided with expert advice from people who have content knowledge about a particular issue, and then the Parliament works out what they want to do with it from there. Now, in that space, there's been no legal challenge of those parliamentary committee reports that have been given back to the Parliament. But what we're talking about here for the voice is really no different in form and structure. Is people with expertise providing advice based on stuff they've heard in community and based on conversations they've had locally and regionally to determine what's the expert view of the world on particular policy and legislation issues that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We're not talking about something constructing a whole new legal precedence here. All we're talking about is providing good policy and legislative advice to give to the Parliament. What the Parliament decides to do with it is up to them. They may use it, they may not use it, but that's the process that we're talking about.
I think one of the things that we've also, I don't know if a lot of people are aware of it, but we've had instances where the Parliament has the authority to do something, and the minister enforces it or makes a decision on it. But we've had a number of cases where people don't agree with it and taken it to the High Court. Now, we just had a recent one where there was a Love case. Now, he was supposed to be deported back to New Zealand, but lawyers decided to help him out and sort of take it to the High Court, and the government lost. And really, Australia has now got an undesirable person staying in the country. So nothing's immune from some individual from taking deference to a decision that's made and taking it to a High Court. So it's a little bit awkward to say that it won't happen. So because individuals are individuals, and a lot of cases have been taken to the High Court have been by individuals.
Yeah, and look at that, and you're right. You cannot. I could not sit here and say that there won't be any legal proceedings that go on as a result of any of this. But what I can say is that what it's about is providing advice to Parliament for them to make a decision about policy and legislation. The case you use in terms of Love, that's not relevant in this conversation because it's an individual that was going through a court proceeding already and who was about to be deported. It wasn't about providing advice to Parliament. So, but what we're saying here is that providing advice to Parliament it isn't immune for Parliament to dismiss the advice, because Parliament dismisses lots of advice all the time. But this is about creating a process that enables Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to hear voices of locals to then inform Parliament about changes to policy and legislation that affect them. And the reality is, at the moment, there is existing legislation, federal government legislation, that is only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So,
do you think it's unhelpful by some prominent people to argue that it is more than just advice? They want more than just advisory. They want an actual say, and that. Do you think that's unhelpful? There are different views from different people within the system,
Yeah.
how they feel it should work.
Yeah, look, and people are entitled to their views and opinions. I guess what this process is about is having a body and having a voice construct that provides advice. It's not about giving some surety to that voice that everything is going to be heard. It's about saying we just want an opportunity to have a conversation about influencing policy and legislation. Just give us that opportunity, and we think we can provide good advice on that.
In that instance, do you think maybe some of the people talking at the different levels, or what their interpretation or what their desire is, needs to be sort of reined in a bit, and to present a more, well, this is actually the line that we want, not people up here and people down there and all that sort of thing, in regards to what they view it should do, because it gives people false representations of what it is.
Yeah, look, and it is a little bit about that, and certainly the biggest, I guess, the biggest debate or the biggest myth that we often talk about with the voice itself is that we're not creating a voice for a bunch of elite Aboriginal Islander people across the country. The voice is being constructed to make sure that we're giving voice to the most vulnerable Aboriginal Islander people in our community, and the role of the voice is about connecting with those people in local communities to make sure that their voices are being heard in Canberra around policy and legislation.
Okay, we'll move on to the next point. This is point 5. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people don't have a voice. While there are a range of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers and peak bodies that work with the government in their area of expertise, First Nation people in communities across Australia do not have the mechanism to be heard by those in Canberra who make the decisions which impact on their everyday life. Now, one thing there are a number of bodies from NGOs, government departments, and other organisations, not for profit, and like in your biography, there's almost 4,000 different bodies representing Aboriginal interests and Torres Strait Islander interests. It's pretty hard to imagine for most of us, in regards to, if you've got that many organisations, that you're not getting heard. I mean, obviously someone's not doing something right if you've got all those organisations and you're not getting the feedback to Canberra or to your local politicians, and that's a bit of a worry.
Yeah, look, it is, and certainly having worked in a few of those organisations, and instead of being a regulator on the other side as well, a lot of those organisations provide services. So they're service providers, and they're contracted services that government gives them a contract to then deliver services in local community. So what happens with them is they're at the bottom end of the spectrum. They're not actually influencing any policy or legislation. All they're doing is trying to influence how the policy and legislation is implemented after it's already been developed. Because
but the other thing is, if those organisations had KPIs, key performance indicators, well, the people providing the money and that should be getting the feedback whether they're doing the job or things need to be modified. But I'm up in Cairns, and I know there's a lot of providers in the youth justice system who collect money, and a fair bit of money, but the outcomes are terrible. Like, there is no good outcomes at the moment in Cairns and Townsville and Rockhampton and other places, Mareeba. So these NGOs, have a big fail as far as most of us are concerned. Do you think one of the things maybe later on for the voice or whatever comes out of it, it takes a rein on all these sort of functions and make sure they're actually pointed in the right direction and we get value for money? Because one of the things the government's never been good at is getting value for money and good outcomes.
Yeah, no, look, and that certainly is one of the things that the voice could play a significant role in, is focusing on what happens in terms of government expenditure and what's government spending money on, and that comes back to that conversation about legislation and policy. is the legislation and policy context right to address the issues? And if the big issues are as they are, and we do see it a fair bit across North Queensland, there are lots of issues in relation to youth justice. And so it's getting back to focus on the policy levers. What are the policy levers and the legislative levers that need to change to give effect to what's going on to improve outcomes in the community? That's not going to happen from a service provider, because the service provider is relying on government funding.
He wants to keep getting funded. He needs failure. He needs failure to keep his business model going. And I think, and that's not just in these sort of instances. There are a lot of NGOs operating in lots of different areas that really want things not to improve, because that serves their better line, bottom line, and that goes for aged care and disabilities and everything. I mean, the last thing that people who are providing service from the NDS want is an improvement, because it's like a golden goose that they want to keep milking. So I think that's a lot of problem in a lot of areas in regards to government money. How do we sort of actually fix the problem with the money we're putting in there and get results? Yeah,
and it is getting back to that conversation about the policy context and the legislation. How do we get that bit right to make sure that we can see better outcomes in community? And the other aspect of that is that when you've got, look, there's many local Aboriginal people across the country who are supporting the voice and saying, well, we actually want to be sitting at the table to influence policy and legislation, but we also want to be responsible for it. Because if it works, we'll champion it. If it doesn't work, then we'll regroup to work out, okay, what do we need to do to fix it? At the moment, they don't have that opportunity, because all that's happening is that it's a trickle-down effect from policy and legislation determined by government, then to say to someone, okay, you get on and do the work.
Yeah, well, that is the problem. It is a trickle down, and there's too many sieve holes on the way to the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on to the next point. The voice will speak to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people. Design principles released by government are very clear. The voice will be representative of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island communities, members, and will be chosen from local people. It will be empowering, community-led, incisive, respectful and culturally informed. So that does tend to say that it should be more in the hands of regional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, not the ones in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Canberra. Now, I'd love to believe that, but again, it's overwhelming numbers of people and influences in those capital cities that seem to drive everything. So it would be interesting to see how that construct is going to be laid out. I suppose a way forward could be at least to look at the makeup of the representation in regards to the people who are going to be representatives for the voice, how it's going to be, how they're going to be picked, and where they're going to come. But my general recollection is that there's a few positions for regional communities, and that it doesn't seem to be the bulk of it, and that concerns me. I think the bulk of the representation should be from the people who need the most help, not the people who can well look after themselves.
Yeah, no, look, and that's certainly the ideology in many of the reports that have been written about what models might look like, is that there's geographical representation. And you get geographical representation, not only just in urban communities, but also rural and regional and remote communities. So it is very much about saying we don't just going to draw people to be a part of the voice from urban areas. It's very much about reaching out into those vulnerable communities to make sure that they have representation and they've got voice in the process, and they're determining who are the people that best represent them to be a part of it.
I think the other thing is who gets the vote, because one of the things that has exploded in the last couple of censuses is the number of people who who recognise themselves as Indigenous. Now, I think it does a disservice to a lot of Aboriginal people, especially in the remote and regional communities, when they see people who identify as Aboriginal and they're sort of, well, it's hard for me to pick that they're Indigenous in the first place, but they're well off. They're won a couple of $100,000 a year salary and that. Do you think if the voting is as wide as, say, 700,000 people who identify as Indigenous, that's going to distort the makeup in regards to who actually needs the voice versus the people who have influence on what the voice looks like?
Yeah, no, look, I think it will be very much about focusing on where do you draw that information from, and in terms of determining who should be the ones that are voting to ensure that you're getting the best representation of the voice, and how do you work with organisations out in rural and regional communities to make sure that they're actually informing what that looks like, and they're part of the process to develop, what's representation, and then the voting process itself. And certainly in some work we've done in Queensland and other states and territories with the Electoral Commission is about having those partnering arrangements with native title organisations, with other land councils and the likes, who already goes through a fairly stringent process to determine who their membership is based upon ancestry and based upon their connection to country. And it's how do you then connect those pieces to make sure that you're giving some credence to I guess, the fact that you're wanting to ensure that you're getting the most vulnerable people that are part of the process and their voices are being heard.
I suppose the thing is, when we see people like Bruce Pascoe identify as an Indigenous person and get kudos from intellectuals and universities in that sort of rubs a lot of people the wrong way in regards to most reasonable person wouldn't think it's fair that he would have a vote or something like that. Is there going to be some? Do you think there needs to be some sort of system to make sure that the people who get to vote are really entitled to it, rather than just people who identify or self-identify as Indigenous?
Yeah, no, look, I think we do need to come up with some different processes. What that looks like at the moment, I'm not sure, but we do need to come up with something that makes sure that we're getting more average threshold people. I mean, the biggest issue
definitely needs something, because I know for a fact that in Western Australia, you can the fishing. If you want a fishing license, you can either pay for it or tell the people down in the post office you're Indigenous. And the whole point is they can't ask you to prove that you're Indigenous. If you say you're Indigenous, well, then you get a fishing license as an Indigenous person. Now, I know people who have done that, and I think that's, well, good on them for being smart enough to do it, but it shows you how problematic things are unless we do have something to make sure Indigenous people are only voting in this issue and voting for the representatives that they want.
Yeah, no, look, and I think the best form of doing that and sorting through identification is to have Indigenous organisations who've been doing it for many, many years involved in designing what the process should look like.
Well, obviously, in regards to Bruce Pascoe, people have, basically recognised or credited him, with Aboriginality. So obviously, that system is can be gamed, is a good word to say, and that's not really acceptable as we go forward. So I hope one of the things would be to make sure that doesn't happen, and the 700,000 people who are identified as Indigenous now have to actually justify their position to be able to vote on for a member and that. A representative.
Yeah.
The next point. A no vote will damage Australia's reputation. It is very likely that this will be the case. However, it's not is not the reason why Australians should consider voting yes. So do you really think people should vote? If people would think, oh, well, I'll vote yes because it makes us look bad, and and we're not doing the right thing by voting no. And do you think we should, when we're making up our mind, give a hoot of what the international overseas people think of our decision?
Look, I think it is important to recognise our place in the world, and if Australia, which is the country where the oldest living culture in the world resides, and if our country then doesn't recognise the oldest living culture in the world that exists here in this country, then there's going to be, people are going to pay attention to that across the globe, and people aren't going to look at that lightly, and they're going to frown upon it. It's not to say that should be a deciding factor, but it's how you're best represented then on the international stage. If the treatment of your Indigenous people, the oldest living culture in the world, isn't something that's done real well in the country.
That's true. But the thing is, to say we don't recognise it, I mean, most Australians recognise the Indigenous people as the first inhabitants. They've been here for 50 to 60,000 years. There's evidence to do that. So there's no doubt that most Australians recognise that fact. But how it's going to be enshrined in the Constitution or why it should be, that is a different matter altogether, and how it's likely to impact on moving forward as a nation. Will it divide us? If it divides us and people think, well, 3% population have got more influence over the parliament than the rest of us, it's going to be difficult to get across the line. The other thing is too, there's also a play of this guilt in regards to Indigenous people and the people who settled here. But when you look at Australia now, we're a very multicultural population, country. How do you play it to a person of Chinese descent or ethnicity, or people who have migrated here in the last 20 or 30 years? How do you sort of convince them that it's worthwhile? Because they played no part in what went before. So how do you appeal to them in this conversation?
Yeah, look, and it's a good point, because when we have discussions with the multicultural community and talk to people who have migrated to this country in the past 20 odd years, then those people are large supporters of the voice to Parliament for Aboriginal Torres Strait people. They get that when we're talking about the most vulnerable people in the country, that those people should actually have a voice, and those people should be able to influence policy and legislation that affects them. And so in many cases, the actual polling of migrant communities and refugee communities across the country is much better than other parts of the Australian community.
Well, if I was a Chinese person, and there's 2 million of us of Chinese origin in Australia, well, I'd be sitting around and saying, well, then I want a voice too, because there's 2 million of us of Chinese ethnic background. So you've got an argument, you've got 500,000, 700,000 people of Indigenous culture wanting a voice. What's to stop the Chinese ethnic group coming up with the same idea? So it's something sort of, I find it surprising that the new immigrants want to buy into this argument, but obviously you've been doing the research and that, so we'll take your word on it. But it's like everything too, isn't it? People can say one thing or whatever up front, but when they go into the ballot box, they make the decision in there, and you just don't know. And even exit polls, because it's such a motive issue, you might not be getting the true response. We will only know that after the ballots are counted.
Yeah, No, absolutely. It's going to be each individual and their conscience when they step into the ballot box come referendum day.
The next item, I found this interesting because I have a little bit of difficulty wrapping my head around that something like the voice could solve the problems that's stated here, but we'll put it up on the screen. The voice would have prevented problems like Alice Springs. The issue faced by communities in Alice Springs are not new and require long-term coordinated actions. They are fueled by poor housing, inadequate administration of the NDIS, amalgamations of rural and remote councils, the failure to diagnose, I'm not sure what FASD is, and cognitive impairment. I don't know. I think that might be drawing a long bow. I mean, the latest flare up in Alice Springs, that was recognisable when you got the new government and they changed the policy. Basically, they were warned, and everyone who had a modicum of sense and reason would have predicted such outcomes and that. The other thing is places like Alice Springs and its ongoing problems, it beggars belief that we haven't fixed those with all the money that goes into the system. How do you think the voice would act to actually remedy that? Will it get the money into the right place? Do you think that's the key to it? And if you do that, wouldn't you be upsetting a number of established organisations or processes and that?
Yeah, and look, there's a couple of pieces of that one, Bill. I guess the first piece is that the most recent outbreak in terms of some of the issues that have been going on in Alice Springs have been directly related to legislation that was lapsing, and neither government did anything about it. Not the current government or the previous government. There's legislation lapsing in relation to the sale of alcohol across Alice Springs, and no one did anything about it. And so
I think to be fair, the Commonwealth knew that it was lapsing, and they took the word of the Northern Territory government that they would fix that, and it lapsed on the basis that the Northern Territory government was going to do what it's supposed to do, because effectively Northern Territory is a state government. As a state government, they've got exceptional powers. The state governments have got a lot of power, and COVID showed that. So it really points that the Northern Territory government was a bit delinquent on its role.
Yeah, look, and I won't comment on the Northern Territory government process, but what I can comment on is the fact that there was legislation on the table, and prior to the legislation on the table that's just lapsed, there was also the Northern Territory intervention legislation that was developed, to emergency response legislation that was developed prior to that. Now, neither of those pieces of legislation, the one that's just lapsed or the previous one, had any input from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It was purely a construct of the government of the day coming up with what they thought was the best legislation to deal with the issues. It wasn't actually a process of engaging with community and engaging with people who have real life experiences to determine what's the best way to address it within the policy and legislation so that we can get a better outcome. And so
it's a bit of worry that communities like Alice Springs that have been there for a long time and there are different groups of Indigenous people there. It's not just one clan or whatever. They have their issues, but it does speak volumes in regards to the inability of the organisation that's supposed to be looking after them to get a construct that actually serves them better than it does.
Yeah, and that's certainly one of the reasons why we're advocating for the voice, to have a voice in place and to be able to then engage with the local Alice Springs community and those who have been working in that community for a long time to determine what the best solutions are, and then influencing government to then change the way that they develop policy and legislation to get better outcomes.
Do you think also maybe our political system is a bit of the problem because we tend to have Labor or Liberal sort of thing, and they're a bit like chalk and cheese in their directions at times, and there's been a lack of partisan effort to resolve these problems. Do you think that's a problem, the politics of the situation?
Yeah, look, politics plays a big role, and certainly what one party wants to do is to make sure that they can do a better job than the other party, irrespective of whether it's blue or red. Those things occur and will continue to occur. And again, it's another reason why we're advocating for a voice, is because whilst you have the change of government, and that'll continue, our policy cycle, our election cycle is short enough that we're going to continue to see a revolving door of blue and red for many years to come. But if you have a construct like the voice that's there to be able to provide advice to whoever's in power at the time to make sure we can get better outcomes, then we think that that's going to work much better.
I think one of the issues too, you're talking about advice to the politicians. I mean, the last government spent $60 billion on consultants and all that sort of stuff over their term, and the Queensland government is full of consultants and bodies and that, and different matters. And I mean, you only have to say, look at our defence policy. You know, here we go. We come up with a white paper that says this, and in a few years along the track, we're not buying these submarines, or aircraft are a priority in that. So nothing the government does is usually much good. Most of the things the more things they're involved in, the more things get buggered up, I think. So from defence, now you're looking at, with defence, you're looking at buying these nuclear submarines, and there's nothing for anyone else. So and this is all at the bequest of different consultants and different advice and that. So in Aboriginal affairs in Torres Strait, there's all these consultants probably advising the government, but we still can't get a good outcome. Do you maybe we need to strip, like, is this the idea of voice? Maybe strip these consultants away, especially on this matter, and have a single body that's more in tune and not going from one scientific paper to another, or psychological paper. This should be the advice, you know, and be more real world than what a lot of the advice that comes to government. Because I mean, if you look at youth justice system, you can look at the people who put into that. You know, they're Professor so and so, this the expert, that expert, but they all live in Brisbane. They've never been they've never been outside Brisbane and that. Yet these are the experts we turn to. So is it really a matter that maybe we've had the wrong consultants and advisors for so long, that these outcomes that we've got were inevitable?
Yeah, no, look, and it is taking a look at that whole system and shaking it up, and that's, as you say, that's the reason for the voice. The voice is about actually being able to reach into those local communities, to hear the local stories, to work out, okay, what's the solution for Cairns? What's the solution for Yarrabah? What's the solution for Arakoon? Let's have the conversation to then work out, okay, what do we come up with? What's the solution we come up with that's actually going to work locally? But how do we also then feed that information back to Canberra and to Brisbane so that they're aware of what's going on and they can make some changes to policy and legislation to suit what's going on locally?
To me, as you spoke there, I was just thinking that maybe there should be a weighting of representation, and maybe the places like Arakoon, Yarrabah, and Konyara and all the others, and then you've got others in West Australia, South Australia, Northern Territory. Do you think maybe there should be a weight system in regards to how people are elected, to ensure we get a good weighting in regards to these regional communities in the future? It doesn't sound very democratic because they're probably in a minority, but sometimes we need a voting system of malapportionment, it's called, where you give more weight to one area than another.
Yeah. No, look, and certainly the approach that we've been taking in the conversation so far, Bill, are about saying the voices for the most vulnerable in our communities. And often the most vulnerable in our communities are in remote communities. So we need to make sure we're hearing those voices and we're privileging those voices so that they can be heard at the table as well. So if that means we look at a different construct about remote representation, then that should be part of the conversation too.
Okay, moving on to the last couple of points. Opponents of the voice are not racist. The No campaign accuses the Yes case of labelling anyone who disagrees with the voice as a racist. I don't think it worries people too much because they know they're going to go into the ballot box and they're going to make their own decision. So it's quite easy for a person who knows they're going to vote no anyway. It's just to say either I'll making my mind up, I'm not sure, or I'm going to vote yes, and it's just not truthful. So I don't think that's a valid argument. I don't think anyone takes it as if they're going to say no that they're a racist. They're just making a decision that based on their beliefs or whatever. And the thing is, it's because it's in a ballot in the ballot box. That's between them and the piece of paper they scribbled on. Yeah,
and look, and I agree. Being in Canberra, I've spoken to many people who are politicians and others around this place the last couple of days who have stated to me that they're going to vote no. And I don't believe that they're racist. They just talked me through the reasons. So I was able to listen and have a conversation with them about those issues, but it doesn't mean that they're racist. People are forming views and opinions based upon what information is out of the public domain. It doesn't make them racist for forming a view that they're going to vote. They're going to vote no. People are entitled to their opinions. People are entitled to their perspectives, and they should make sure that they're reading information to help them form whatever view that they're going to have on ballot day.
Well, I suppose that one of the big things that happened in the first instance when the government refused to, in the first instance, wasn't even going to send out any information to people to make a decision on, like a normal referendum. They came around on that. There's no attempt they decided we're not going to fund either the yes or no case, but knowing that the yes case is going to be funded by billionaires and things like that. And there's already, a good part of $50 million already in the coffers of the yes campaign and that. So, but I don't think that makes any difference to the man in the street sort of thing. He doesn't care if Holmes, the court stands up there and says you've got to do this or some other person. But I don't think it's helpful when some people sort of do say things like, a no vote is bad and it's racist, and you won't be getting me to give you a welcome to country and all this sort of stuff. And that's been said by a couple of prominent people that if there's a no vote, they're basically condemning the other part of the Australian population as racist and things like that. So I don't think that's helpful. And really, when someone says that they're not going to perform welcome to the country anymore, I think that's probably a relief to a lot of people, because a lot of people now think it's a bit overused, and that so it's become something that's been too common to have significance anymore. The last point. The voice will close the gap. Through regional dialogues, we heard many examples of policies and laws that negatively impact on the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Those communities also know how they could be improved to make a difference, but they are not being heard. I think that's legitimate in regards to, I think there's a general complaint everywhere, especially in Northern Queensland, in Torres Strait Islands and and the communities is they're not heard and the problems keep continuing. But it's definitely not from the lack of people caring or people or money. It is obviously the process and the mythology that goes on, because I think every Australian wants better outcomes for Indigenous people, and wants them to have every opportunity to become members of the global community. I mean, it's not a matter of just improving your lot where you are. It's having the opportunity to go wherever you want, to be whatever you want. And I think that construct needs to be put out there more. I mean, we have situations where every child can go to school, every child can get an education, whether their parents are encouraging them to or whether they're taking advantage. That's a different thing altogether. But surely that's what we want to do in the future, allow people to get to anywhere they want to be and be whatever they want to be, rather than just tied to, we'll stay here and we'll just hope things get better or more services come. Do you think there's got to be a balance between encouraging people to get that education and be more worldly? I mean, we don't want people just to think they're going to live in Yarrabah all their lives. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are just going to be there when the world is big as it is, and with the opportunities that's there for everyone, provide they put the effort in. And that's really the key, isn't it? Taking the opportunities that are presented.
Yeah, no, look, it is, and it is about making sure that people can see the world view outside of their lounge room and outside of their own community, and providing those sort of opportunities for people to explore and to test those opportunities and take whatever's in front of them. And certainly there's plenty of local stories, including in Yarrabah, where the community itself has come up with a range of solutions and a range of ideas about how to look at improving things and how to address some of the issues and concerns that are going on in community. It's really about, at the moment, it's really about how hard government is listening to those solutions and stories. And that's why we think that certainly the voice can have an effect in closing the gap in real outcomes in communities, because it's actually about giving the voice to the vulnerable and hearing them and hearing their story and working out how do we help them.
I think there's also a level of dumbness in the government in some of the things that they offer as packages and think it's going to be an advantage. I mean, the classic one up here is the jetty that they built at Yarrabah that's only functional for part of the year because it's too high out of the water, when they really should be looking at a better road system or bridge or something to allow people to cross that Trinity Inlet. I mean, a ferry service that runs once in a blue moon and then is out of action for a third of the year is a waste. There's no long-term plan. I mean, for Yarrabah, for me, is there has to be a road somewhere past a little bit up Trinity Inlet somewhere to get across the other side and cut 40 or 50 kilometres off the road journey to Yarrabah. I mean, that's just a no-brainer, but the government pats themselves on the back for building an $11 million jetty that's basically unserviceable. And that's the thing you've got to contend to with when you deal with politicians.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Look, and that's always been the case when you're thinking of Indigenous affairs and some of those wonderful stories we hear across the country, where people come up with some great ideas, but those great ideas don't come to fruition because the politician or the fly in fly out government worker or someone else has come in with a newer idea and a better idea in their view, and they then impose those ideas on the local community, as opposed to listening to what the local community is suggesting and then working with them to work out how can they make it work better.
Okay, look, we've well and truly burned up your hour, and you obviously got to go somewhere else, I'm sure, or you must be getting hungry or something, seeing you're in Canberra and you've got to be somewhere else. Look, I really appreciate the time you've given to us. I think it was very informative, and like I say, the points that Pat laid out was very sort of insightful in regards to, as a matter of fact, as a discussion point. And like I say, I think this is the information and sort of background we need before we go forward to our individual emotive positions on this issue. But if you'd just like to conclude or wrap up now, be most welcome.
Yeah, no, look, thanks very much for the opportunity. Really appreciate you having me on the show, and certainly want to reiterate the point that the work that we're trying to give effect to here is giving voices to the most vulnerable in our community. Me as an Aboriginal person, and certainly I have no aspiration. I'm a strong advocate, and I'm working towards making sure we can win the referendum at the end of the year. But I'm not one of those people that will be putting my hand up to be a part of the voice, because I already have a voice. And that's certainly the case for many of the people who are advocating for the voice at the moment. We already have a voice. We already have conversations with government. We already have influence in terms of having conversations with ministers and politicians and policy makers. What we're doing here is the work to make sure that those voices, those vulnerable voices who don't get that opportunity, get a seat at the table. And that's what we'll work towards. And that's the model that we want to put in place next year.
Well, like I said, I'd just love to see the weighing in regards to the representation put on the people in the regions and the communities. And like you say, people like yourself, the other people who have already had input into the Uluru statement, they're well respected. They've got a lot of influence and always have had influence for a long time. They, like you say, they don't need it. And that's why I would hope that there's a focus on the people out in the regions, out in the communities. And there's good people, there's hardworking people out there. So I'm sure you get enough talent. And the other thing is, I'm sure their communities would be given, chewing their ear every 5 minutes to get an outcome they want that improve their lot. Whereas if there's some of the people that have already got influence and they live down in Canberra or Melbourne and that, you're not going to be able to chew their ear. And I think that's one of the big problems with regional representation for everyone, is that most of the people with the power, their ears are down in Canberra and Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, and we don't get a chance to chew them.
Yeah, no, we want to make sure that there is that regional voice and there's that remote voice as part of this process for us.
Okay, then, look, thanks very much for your time tonight. If you can just stay on the line for a second, I'll just introduce next week's guest and wind up the show. Thanks, Selwyn. Selwyn, if you enjoyed tonight's show, please like and share and subscribe to our Facebook page or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, we will have people from the Bishops Creek hydrogen project in Western Australia who give us an oversight of their project and the value of the hydrogen economy in the future. So please join us again then, please. Thank you. Okay, Andrew.